So welcome everyone to this presentation on July 25th. So we're over halfway through this, what I'm calling, and every astrologer on the planet is calling a pivotal year. And all astrologers knew this was going to be a pivotal year. They just didn't know exactly how it would play out in terms of the virus, for example. But I'm going to show you why that is, because there are some key transits occurring in 2020. And this is the turning point. And of course, it's a very dramatic one, as we can see. And so this presentation is sort of updating you on that in terms of reviewing what I've already said for many years, but maybe just reviewing that in a brief sense, and also previewing the next half of the year and what that might bring about as well. So let me just begin. So the first thing we always do with astrology, and Indian astrology in particular, is we chant for Ganesh, because Ganesh is the lord of Vedic or Indian astrology. So another name for Ganesh is Ganapati. So this is a very popular chant, and I can just say it 3 times to begin. Om Gang Ganapatiye Namah. Om Gang Ganapatiye Namah. Om Gang Ganapatiye Namah. So this is a good way to start something, whatever you're doing. It could be study, it could be a ritual, a prayer after, or whatever you do. It's a good way of starting anything, because he removes blocks. That's the main purpose of Ganesh. He removes obstacles. This is a really lovely image of taken in Roundwood in County Wicklow. If anyone gets a chance to go there in Ireland, it's a great place to visit, to see all the Ganesh statues and many other statues as well. Really a fabulous place. So let me go on. This I had in, so basically this is a presentation that I've pared down for this hour. I did a 2-hour long presentation on January 12th earlier this year. And the slides are pretty much the same. I've taken in this and I've updated it somewhat, because obviously things have happened since. So, and I'll show you what I mean as I go through. But it's half the slides. So I've kind of took out the key slides out of a 2-hour presentation for this. And this was the first slide I put in. And I put it in a sense, thinking that 2020, when I looked at the transits for 2020, that there's so much going on that I kind of put in this proverb to kind of remind people that whatever happens, nothing happens, all is. But this has a different meaning now when we understand what's actually happened, because many things aren't happening, of course. Nothing is happening in many ways because it's lockdown, right? So that's another kind of twist or another angle on this proverb, nothing happens, all is. That's just something I wanted to point out. Okay, so the preview or review first, and then preview for this year. Pardon me, because I have to keep clicking when people keep entering the room, so I have to admit them. This is one of the things with Zoom, is that you have to admit people because of security reasons now. So just to review them, and I've again just picked out the main sort of big transits. There's so many transits going on all the time, of course, but the main big transits, and these are the main conjunctions especially, are Saturn and Pluto conjunction, which I'm going to talk a lot about. Jupiter-Pluto conjunction, which is happening all year long, a long transit, and very unusual because it's so long. And then at the end of the year, in December on the solstice, the Jupiter-Saturn. Now, any one of those transits and conjunctions in any given year would have been big news for astrology, any one of them. But we've had 3 of them all in one year. So this is why all astrologers were talking about 2020 for many years, because Saturn-Pluto is a big conjunction and shows big events in the world. But these 2 also do, Jupiter-Pluto and Jupiter-Saturn, and they all came together in the same sign the beginning of this year. So that's one thing I'll talk about. Anyway, the other thing I'll talk about are the eclipses, the lunar nodes, the nodes of the moon when they line up with the sun and moon, that we have an eclipse. And the eclipses this year are also very impactful, and they all occur near the solstice. So, and the eclipse I'll point out as well from December 2019, on December 26, 2019, was the trigger for the virus. And I'll show you the chart for that. But the fact that we also had the, just recently in June, the solstice eclipse, again, right on the eclipse. And we have yet another eclipse, and this time a total solar eclipse near the winter solstice, right before Jupiter and Saturn come together. So these are all big transits. And again, any one of those would have been a big year, but you put like all of them together in 1 year, and it's just a lot, of course, to handle. And this is again why this is called a pivotal year. So the other thing I'm going to talk about a bit more, which I didn't talk about in January so much, but I'm going to refer to it now because an important point, is Mars. And Mars is going to go retrograde from next month, September, and it's in Aries as it does that. And so the latter part of the year, this is going to be another key signature of the year. And I'm going to show what that means, and also how it conflicts really with what's going on here in Capricorn. All of these planets are coming together in Capricorn again at the end of the year. So I'll talk about all of those. Okay, so again, in the background all year is the Saturn-Pluto conjunction that occurred in January. But even though they're not going to come back exactly together again, they will come close by the end of the year. So that's worth keeping in mind. Then there's the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction, which occurred from the beginning of the year, April and March exact, but lasts all the way till the end of the year. And I'll show you what that means. And then finally, the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, which happens every 20 years or so, is happening in December, on the exactly on the solstice in December. So this is another pivotal transit. We'll talk about that as well. So the first one is the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. Now, again, any one of these in any given year would have brought about big changes on the planet. But again, having them all three big major conjunctions all in 1 year is just made it the most impactful. So the Saturn-Pluto, Saturn represents borders, boundary, form, and Pluto is the lord of the underworld, or what is sometimes referred to as the lord of death. And it dissolves things. And so every time Saturn and Pluto come together, borders, boundaries are dissolved. And it's scary. And though last time I did this presentation, I didn't want to put fear in people's minds, or last year when I was speaking about the possible, a possible recession, we as astrologers have to be very mindful of course, fear mongering. But at the same time, we're now, this is the unfortunate thing of being in this role, we're now at the same time being told that, oh, you didn't get it right with the virus, you didn't predict the virus, whatever it might be. And this is a kind of fine line that we astrologers have to walk all the time, is that we can see things coming down the line and we don't want to fearmonger. And at the same time, we want to, prepare people for what's coming. So we can talk about it now in hindsight. So we can really go there in a sense, because Saturn-Pluto conjunctions are really challenging. And every time they come together throughout history is a very challenging period on the planet. And it kind of shows these sort of end times periods, a feeling of things are coming to an end. Literally, like even humanity is coming to an end. That's how it can feel sometimes. Because again, Saturn is form, is structure, is boundary, and Pluto is dissolving those boundaries, and even boundaries between this life and the next, if you want to look at it that way. But even practically, it's boundaries like, even the fact that we're talking about a virus now, and we're having to cover up and be very, very mindful of our boundaries and our space between other people. That's all Saturn. And so this Saturn-Pluto conjunction shows up in all this fear. Going back in history, one of the most challenging times was that when they came together twice, not in just 1 year, but the following year as well, 1914, 1915. And that was, of course, World War I. So, and the fact that they came together in Gemini, and this lunar mansion called Ardra, which is the lord of Rudra, rules this. And if you know anything about the Indian pantheon of gods, there's Shiva and there's Rudra. And Shiva is like the yogi, the meditative aspect, but Rudra is his sort of red, angry form. And so this Rudra rules this sign in Gemini. And when Pluto and Saturn came together, we had World War One. So of course, that's, you know, because it was twice, 2 years in a row, and in this very really challenging lunar sign. So that was World War One. The next time they came together was in 1947, and of course we had India and Pakistan break up, and a lot of things happened in 1947. But that's just one example, and you know, millions of people were killed, and this occurred in Cancer. These are all, by the way, sidereal fixed star signs I'm using in Indian astrology, the actual astronomical calculations, not the tropical seasonal calculations, just in case you're wondering. Either way, they're the same conjunctions, whether you're using whichever zodiac you're using. The next time they came together was in 1982, and was the HIV/AIDS crisis. So this is, you know, why, you know, astrologers were looking at the Saturn-Pluto conjunction this year, along with the other conjunctions and the eclipses, and thinking, yeah, of course, this is likely now there's going to be something. And of course, come forward to this year, 2020, and they come together again in the sign Sagittarius, and we get the coronavirus, another coronavirus, this COVID-19. So it just brings up all of these fears, of course, of end times, and Extinction Rebellion is a good expression of this conjunction, because Pluto is the extinction. Again, it literally dissolves things. And Saturn is the rebellion. Saturn represents the rebels of society rising up. It's the revolutionary. So it's like literally playing out as Extinction Rebellion. So there's so many examples I could use, but obviously the virus is the main one here. This dissolving of boundaries and the need to keep our safe boundary around us and protection. And this end time sort of feel, and this, you know, this sense of humanity is on a slippery slope. But these are cycles, like in everything in astrology. This has come around again and again, and it will come around many more times. So the next conjunction then is the Jupiter-Pluto. So we had Saturn with Pluto, and now we have Jupiter with Pluto. And this actually happens even longer this year. They normally just come together once and it's over with. This time they're coming together 3 occasions: March, June, and November. And so it means that it's a 6-month long conjunction of these two. So it's it brings up some issues, of course, but it also brings up some insights. And these are some fascinating correlations with the Jupiter-Pluto conjunctions, because so these are examples in history of when they came together. In 1906, Clyde Tombaugh was the astronomer who discovered Pluto, and he was born in that year that they came together. So it hadn't obviously been discovered until 1930. But the guy who discovered it was born during a Jupiter-Pluto conjunction. Because one of the things about Jupiter is that it brings insights. It brings expansion and knowledge and awareness. And again, Pluto is the lord of the underworld, and he represents the destructive capabilities of man, of course, but also the deepness, the depths of our being. And so every time they come together, there's some discovery made. So 1918, Venetia Burney, she was born, and she later named the planet, which is another interesting correlation. And then in 1930, of course, it was discovered, as well as this character, Disney character, interestingly enough, called Pluto, was named Pluto. And, you know, he's yellow like Jupiter, but he also has this black, you know, and he's kind of got this blackness about him as well, which is Pluto. It's kind of an interesting mix of the two. So then things that have happened more recently, we had 1968, 69 moon landing. We had 81 Hubble Space Telescope, 94, 95, the first detailed images of outer space. This was the Pillars of Creation, this famous image now. New Horizons reaches Jupiter as it sets out for Pluto in 2007. There's always these correlations and this movement into space, especially. And the latest one, so this has happened since I did the last presentation. Catherine D. Sullivan, her expedition to the Challenger Deep, which is the deepest known point in the ocean. And this is fascinating. I was bowled over when I saw this. So this is the first woman, American woman, to walk in space, and now the first woman to reach the deepest part of the ocean, which is actually known as the Hadal Zone. Now it's called, this is fascinating, it's called the Hadal Zone after Hades, which is the Greek name for Pluto. So this woman, Catherine D. Sullivan, is basically the first woman, this happened just last month, by the way, as they came together exactly to again, Jupiter-Pluto. So this is a picture of where it is exactly in the world, this Challenger Deep. This whole ridge here is the deepest part of the ocean in the world, and again called the Hadal or Hades zone, the zone of Pluto, if you want to call it that. So it's just fascinating that that has happened now with this conjunction again. So moving on, the next and the final conjunction that will, oh, by the way, I want to say one more thing about this, because yeah, there are lots of outer space explorations, and we've just seen the launch of, you know, the Mars exploration, because Mars is coming closer to Earth now. But there are also very many other explorations and insights and in-depth awareness of things like viruses. So of course, this is one of the key things about this year's Jupiter-Pluto. It's about understanding our own inner space as well, and our own biology. Because another thing that's happened throughout history during the Jupiter-Pluto conjunctions is that, for example, the microscope was invented. Our first kind of ability to look deeply into ourselves as well. So it's not just about looking deeply into space or into the depths of the ocean. It's also about our ability to look deep within ourselves. And so this, even though Pluto is the lord of death, he's the lord of the underworld. So it's the lord of our depths and our sense of self as well. So Jupiter-Pluto can give enormous amounts of insights into ourselves. And this lockdown period, of course, has given us that as well. Okay, so I'll move on. The next conjunction, the final big one, and this happens more regularly, it happens every 20 years, but it's a very significant one in terms of the social structure and economics and politics and everything, systems of the world. That is Jupiter-Saturn. So Jupiter and Saturn come together exactly on December 21st, the solstice this year. So this is a really good image by Edith Hathaway. She's an Indian or Vedic astrologer. And she has this graph or this image that really highlights the fact that we are, and I don't have to mince my words anymore with this because it's already happened, we are at the lowest point right now. And what does it mean, lowest point? Well, we're at the lowest point in terms of this cycle of Jupiter-Saturn, because Jupiter-Saturn cycles go through different elements, and they're currently moving through the Earth period, the Earth signs, and it's they're meeting again on December 21st this year in the sign Capricorn, and the lowest because Jupiter is at its weakest in Capricorn. And what is Jupiter? Remember, we've already talked about Jupiter-Pluto being together. Now we're talking about Jupiter-Saturn at the end of the year. Jupiter is hope, basically. Jupiter is faith. And that is being severely tested right now. And so we've lost hope and we have lost faith. But practically in the world around us, it also represents expansion and growth, and more obviously expressed in the economy. And this is why last year I predicted a recession by the end of 2020. And I said it would be a very up and down year economically because of the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction. So sort of lots of in and out and, you know, ups and downs. And that's how it's playing out, it seems. So there's a lot of obviously challenges in that, but a lot of bailouts and all of that happening as well. And so it hasn't really hit fully yet, and it won't until December. So on December 21st, when they come together exactly, Jupiter-Saturn, we're going to see a downturn. The good news is that the downturn is the turning point, And so we're at the lowest, and there's only one way after reaching the lowest part, and that's up. So these are images that are somewhat disturbing, of course, but it's important to look at them. It's really important to look at this image because it highlights where we're at. So this image on the right is of that recent spate of elephants just mysteriously dying in Somalia, and no one knows why. And there's kind of theories about that. It could be a virus amongst elephants themselves, but basically the image itself is what's most telling, because there's a very mythical image on the left that you might see here that is very appropriate for this event. So this is quite recent. All of these elephants, hundreds of elephants dying, and just they don't know why. It's just a complete mystery. This image on the left is the story of Gajendra. Gajendra is the elephant, and this is whole story to describe the elephant, which is another way of looking at Jupiter. Jupiter is symbolized by an elephant, and the sign Capricorn is symbolized by a crocodile. So when Jupiter goes into Capricorn, as I said, it's at its weakest. It's called what is known as debilitation in astrology. And so it's debilitated. It's just knocked out. It just cannot function as well. And so again, in terms of Jupiter and the elephant, Jupiter is our faith and hope. And this image is most striking because of even at the worst time in our life, when it's hopeless, that's when we reach for God. This is basically what this image is saying. And this is who's coming to the rescue. This is an image of God coming to the rescue. And Gajendra, the elephant, is actually offering God a flower, even while being trapped in the jaws of the crocodile in the swamp. And the swamp and the crocodile are all symbolic of being caught in the illusion of this world and the kind of trials and tribulations of this world, and losing faith in that. But even in that deepest, darkest part of ourselves, we can offer something up. We can just offer our service up, offer our prayers up, whatever it may be, but to offer something up, and to in the deepest, darkest parts of it, to keep our faith. So this is highly symbolic, the fact that all of these elephants died during this period, again, during another Jupiter-Pluto conjunction, by the way. And again, Pluto is the lord of death. So it's literally symbolically playing out. Sometimes you just cannot make this up. So the next one, as I said, would be Jupiter-Saturn. We're still continuing to have this Jupiter-Pluto conjunction all year, all through November. It's exact again in November, just before Jupiter then moves into Capricorn once again in November. And so there's a real downturn by the end of the year in the winter. And the obvious expression of that, of course, could be a recession, as well as another lockdown, as well as another wave of the virus. All of that's possible. But again, beyond that, it's more important that we, again, keep the faith, that we, in this deepest, darkest part of it in the winter, that we hold on to something other than this life is offering us right now. And we look within, and we find that within ourselves. Practically in the world around us, the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in history have shown kind of this boom-bust kind of thing going on. So for example, John Lennon, I'll just use the example of the Beatles. John Lennon was born in 1940 when Jupiter and Saturn came together. The Beatles' debut album was released in 1960, 20 years later when they came together again. So it's this kind of boom bust, because the next time in 1980, Lennon was shot. 20 years later, use another example, Jupiter-Saturn came together and we saw bursting of the technology bubble, as it was called, in 2000. And now we're at 2020. So Jupiter represents high hopes and the economy. This is the same slide I used in January. I haven't changed it. And so what I said then was Jupiter represents high hopes. The economy will likely rise and fall in 2020, while Saturn makes things real, sometimes too real, and can show things initiated on high hopes coming to an untimely ending. So this is what I'm thinking, that the end of the year is kind of going to bottom out in terms of the economy, because there's been initial kind of payouts and sort of bailouts and all of that, and trying to correct the situation. So the good news is that Saturn actually, when it goes with Jupiter, it actually cancels Jupiter's debilitation or weakness in 2020 and 2021. So that suggests to me that, you know, it's not all bleak, that there is some hope in reforms, and that the reforms that need to happen will happen. But there's another element here, because if it were just Jupiter and Saturn coming together, we could say that it was all about reforms and the economy will, you know, go through a major nosedive, but then they'll, you know, do a bailout or whatever, or then more than that, they'll probably, you know, do something major with the economy that they didn't do last time. But, and the big but is Pluto, because the last time Jupiter and Saturn came together in Capricorn was 1961. And in 1961, it was actually economically a good time, because I said Saturn cancels Jupiter's weakness when they come together. The problem here is they're coming together along with Pluto, the lord of the underworld. So this image highlights it here. You have, this is the sign Sagittarius, which represents Jupiter. And this is the sign Capricorn, which represents Saturn. And this is Scorpio, which represents Pluto coming up from the underworld. And so this is, it's really Pluto that's creating the bigger changes here, and the death and destruction and dissolving of not just the economy, but again, our hope, our faith in the system as well, because Saturn's all about systems. The place they're all doing this in is the lunar mansion, because in Indian astrology, we use more so lunar mansions. We use the 12 sun signs, of course, but we divide it up into 27 moon signs or lunar mansions. And it's called Uttara Shada, and it literally means the ladder victor, the ladder victory, which is very interesting. The fact that all of these planets are coming together in a sign that suggests victory comes later, whether it's victory over the virus or whatever. So Uttara Shada symbols are an elephant and the planks of a bed. So these are very symbolic. The elephant symbol ties this lunar mansion to the previous Purva Shada. So Ashada means victorious. Uttara just means ladder. Purva means former. And so the previous sign, Purva, is symbolized by an elephant's tusk, while this sign here is symbolized by breaking through initially, and then like standing firm in that, or charging ahead like the elephant. And again, it's just so interesting that these elephants all died during this period. The other symbol, though, is the planks of a bed, and it's symbolic of hardships that must be endured to achieve something, and the austerities we must endure to make something happen. And in this case, of course, to overcome the virus. So having to put up with austerities this year is one of the key themes. And that continues throughout the year into next year. So to recap, and just to give you the dates, Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto are all together in Capricorn again at the end of the year. They came together in the beginning of the year, and that kind of triggered all of this, and they're coming together again, closely together again by the end of the year. Jupiter is going in and out of Capricorn for the next couple of years, or for the next year and a half, until November 2021. So it won't really fully lift until November 2021, in other words. There will be an initial lift, though, in April of next year, 2021, because it will initially move out of Capricorn, its weakest place, but then it's going to move back into Capricorn from September. But that's a very brief September to November. That might suggest that there's a sort of yet another wave going into the autumn winter of 2021, but it's a brief one, and so hopefully by then as well there'll be something in place that can deal with it. So it's an up and down period for the next year and a half also. Saturn is here though for 3 years. So January, it moved in at the end of January this year, and it stays there until January 2023. So Saturn isn't really the problem, though, even though it does create this strong sense of, restriction and limitation. It's not always a bad thing. It's the combination of it with Pluto, and at the same time, the weakness of Jupiter, our hope, that's creating the problem. Saturn really isn't the problem. Saturn is actually our responsibility, our ability to do what needs to be done. to step back and say, okay, this is what we need to do long term, and to stick with it. So that's actually very strong in Capricorn. Saturn is said to rule Capricorn. So this is not the problem at all. The problem is Pluto. Because Jupiter is not really the problem long term. When they all come together in the short term for this year, next year, yes. But long term, if you want to say the problem is Pluto. And the problem is that we have to change everything, because Pluto is the lord of the underworld, but again, dissolving things, removing things, changing things from the ground up. And it just poked its head into Capricorn this year from the end of February, and it moved out at the end of June. And it won't move back in again till the end of the year, December 30th. And will stay there for 20 years. So this is just the beginning of changes to Capricorn. And what is Capricorn? Capricorn is a system we're working within, a government, a society that we function within. I'll talk more about this in a minute, but basically it's now just the beginning of a 20-year-long period of changing how things are done, basically. So I've highlighted here the fact that Mars is going into Aries August 16th until October 4th. It will retrograde and it will go back into Pisces and then return to Aries at the end of the year. Now, Mars in Aries is a strong position for Mars. However, the reason I'm putting it over on this side and separating it out from these is because it can create a problem. And the problem is that Mars in Aries wants freedom. It just wants to do what it wants to do. It wants to move. It wants to be free. And it's in stark contrast to all of these here in Capricorn. And Capricorn is more about not necessarily what we want to do personally, but what we have to do for the greater good. That's what Capricorn is all about. If you know anyone with Capricorn rising or moon sign or very prominent in their chart, you'll know how they always do the responsible thing. And they're always, in the background, doing things for other people as well. And so this is the key theme of this year as well, is this, the essential services and all of that, and the people who you don't normally see coming to the forefront. So this is a sign Capricorn, and it's in stark contrast to Aries because they're in a square from each other. Capricorn, if you count from Capricorn to Aries, it's 4 signs away. That's an angle, a square relationship, and it's a contrasting relationship. So this Mars and Aries now is going to create this huge need now, especially from the beginning of August, and this huge push for freedom. Basically, we want our freedom at any cost sometimes. So historically, Pluto in Capricorn has been huge change on the planet. It represents big changes in structures around the world. Here's some examples, because the last time it was in Capricorn, there was the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so it's not a small change at all that it brings about. It's a big change. So what kind of revolution are we having now? Well, I guess some sort of tech revolution, I guess. Working online, I guess. I don't know. I mean, these are all just guesses because I don't know how this is going to play out. The most obvious one would be AI and the way we work. But if you look back as well, you see that there was, I've highlighted it here, obsolete and environmentally damaging technologies were overhauled. This is, in the late 1770s, and replaced by new systems that were sustainable. So we're back here again over 250 years later. Back then, there was also massive growth in business and banking. This is the first building society, the birth of modern day economics, the last time Pluto was in Capricorn. Slavery outlawed in Britain, but an increase in slave trade in Africa. We're seeing sex trafficking and slavery, in our modern era as well. And so that's coming to the forefront as well now. American Revolution, oh yeah, of course, and the French Revolution. So Pluto in Capricorn tends to bring about huge changes, and because it happens so slowly, it's not an overnight sensation. It's 20 years long. So from 2020 to 2040, we're going to see, some big changes on the planet, how everything is run, how governments are run, how banking is done, how we transact, how we work, how we live. slavery, all of that is going to come back, you know, in terms of our awareness and having to deal with that. And revolutions, you know, so there's a lot going to happen in the next 2 decades. Saturn in Capricorn in the more immediate time frame, because it's 3 years, we can look back at the last time it was here in 1990 to 1993. We had the World Wide Web. So that was that. The end of the Cold War and collapse of Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall. So, I mean, it's going to show. Okay, could I ask everybody to mute themselves, because I'm getting a couple of messages here that people aren't muted, and even though I'm not hearing anything, so apologies for those that are on the call. I don't hear anything on my end. But if you're hearing something, I apologize. So if everybody could mute themselves, please. If not, I'm going to have to go through everyone and mute. Okay, let me just try muting everyone. Sorry about this. It'll just take a minute. Okay, I think everyone's muted. Okay, so this time, now we've already started to see changes. So from 2020 to 2023, you know, obviously changes in the way we work, work practices, you know, literally where we work, how we do our work, restructuring our governments and countries. Of course, we're seeing now with Saturn, you know, even though last time it was the fall of the Berlin Wall, Saturn in Capricorn can just as easily, you know, build walls, right? So we can see that in America, we can see it around the world, in Europe, in terms of countries, you know, becoming this kind of nationalist sort of thing with Saturn, because Saturn is all about the boundary. Reform of the banking system, you know, the way we do business and the way money is exchanged and so on and so on. There's so many possibilities here, of course. I don't know exactly how it's all going to play out, but it is most certainly in the next few years going to play out in redrawing of lines in many, many ways. And then just again, more immediately, even more so in the next year is this Jupiter in Capricorn. And the last time Jupiter in Capricorn was 2008, 2009, and that was the last economic downturn. So every time Jupiter comes into Capricorn, there's a downturn. It's not unusual. But again, this time, despite Saturn being there and helping things out, Pluto is what's creating the problem underneath it all. And again, this image, which is quite striking again, of Jupiter, the elephant caught in Capricorn. So hopefully we'll see some restructuring and reforms, you know, sooner than later, but ultimately we are going to see them. This is just the beginning of some major reforms on the planet. Now, added to all of those major conjunctions, of course, we have the eclipses occurring all year near the solstice. And the first one, and I'm bringing this into 2020, even though it happened at the end of last year, because this was the start of the virus, or this was not necessarily the start of the actual virus, but the time of this eclipse, and I'll show you the chart, showed the actual timing of when we became aware of it. And it just blossomed since then. And so how that may play out in the future as well, looking at that chart and subsequent charts, because the next one we just experienced in June. These are 2 annular solar eclipses, pretty much a total solar eclipse. And the next one on December 14th, pretty close, a week before the solstice, is a total solar eclipse, and it's at 28 degrees Scorpio. So the fact that they're all on the solstices is also highly significant. So again, it just points to a year of big changes. This is the chart. Now, pardon for those who don't have any astrology or are not familiar with how charts are read, especially Indian astrology, where they use this kind of style box. I'll just use it, hopefully explain a little bit about it. So this is the December 26th eclipse last year, the annular solar eclipse. You might notice, and the one thing you might notice is that there's a huge amount of a cluster of planets in the sign Sagittarius here. So this is where the eclipse occurred, with the moon and the sun here together. Yeah, Mercury, of Saturn and Pluto. I mentioned the Saturn-Pluto Conjunction, as well as the Pluto-Jupiter Conjunction. Ketu in Indian astrology is what we used for the south node of the moon. That's what we call the south node of the moon, the southern eclipse point. And Rahu, opposite the north node of the moon, is opposite the south node exactly. So pretty much everything was in the sign Sagittarius except for Venus and Mars on either side. And this sign here where the eclipse occurred is the beginning of the virus. And it's in the beginning of Sagittarius. And you might think, well, why Sagittarius? What's the harm there? The harm there is that the nodes of the moon, the eclipses, in these particular signs, Gemini and Sagittarius, are in two lunar mansions that are at the lowest part, the lowest in terms of the most southerly lunar mansions. So we have this saying, you know, when things go south, you know, when things kind of really drop, or when things go south, it's like things fall apart. And these two lunar mansions, I mentioned earlier the one called Ardra, ruled by the god of storm, Rudra. This is where the north node is placed. And the south node, Ketu, is placed in one that's called Mula, and means root. And it's ruled by the goddess of death. So this is like the god of death, Rudra. And opposite it is the goddess of death, Niriti. So you have the god and goddesses of death both being triggered during this last eclipse in December last year. And Jupiter was there, and Jupiter expands. It's the biggest planet in our solar system. All this while Saturn and Pluto were pushing boundaries and dissolving boundaries and creating this fear of end times. And this is what started it all off. So this is the goddess of death, Niriti. And, you know, she literally uproots us. It's in the sign of the root, Mula. If you know yoga, you might be familiar with Muladhara chakra, the root chakra. So Mula is all about our roots, and our roots are literally at this time being cut, and we're feeling uprooted, and we're feeling very uncertain as to what's happening in the world, and we're all feeling very scared. And she brings a lot of fear, Niriti, the beginning of Sagittarius, as well as at the same time opposite, we have this god, Rudra, who's like a stormy, fierce, angry god, a red form of Shiva, and he's the god of destruction. So a lot of destruction, obviously, during this period. And where is this going to lead? Well, later on in September, so especially since January, because the South Node moved into this sign of Niriti, the goddess of death, since January, there's been a lot of fear around, of course, and we've felt very uprooted. But by the end of September, they move signs. The South Node moves into Taurus, Scorpio, and the North Node into Taurus. So the fear levels will decrease somewhat. And the reason for that is that, and if you look back in history, and I've got a list of things here, I didn't want to put too much into these slides, but there's so many things that have happened when the nodes moved through Taurus and Scorpio as well, subsequent to all the kind of fallout in the previous signs that I mentioned of the goddess and god of death. For example, the last time the nodes moved through those signs of death, we had 9/11, right? And then subsequent to 9/11, of course, then there was the Iraq invasion, and that happened when the nodes moved into Taurus and Scorpio, because Taurus and Scorpio is more about getting safe again. We want safety. Taurus especially, we want stability. And then Scorpio is like, we need to remove the things that are making us unsafe so that we can have stability and safety in Taurus. And so as soon as the nodes move by the end of September, now this September, things are going to feel like, okay, now we're doing something to get safe again. And so there might be also some insights into this virus, because if we go back even further, the last time that the nodes were here again, 18 years before that again, was the time of the AIDS crisis. And so when the nodes were in again, the signs of the goddess of death and, Niriti, and the god of death, Rudra, we had the AIDS epidemic. We had the AIDS epidemic, right? So initially, while the nodes were moving through these signs of death, basically, it was all about the fear of the unknown, just as we're having this year. It's that we don't know, we can't see a virus. The nodes represent virus. They actually literally in astrology rule viruses. So that's why there's so much fear. If we could see the virus, we wouldn't be as fearful. But we can't see the nodes of the moon. We don't see eclipse points until there is an actual eclipse. So it's very briefly during an eclipse, and the rest of the time they operate outside of our vision. So it's like this invisible, these viruses that are around that are invisible that creates all the fear. So the last time I mentioned it was 9/11. It was all that fear. The time before that was the AIDS crisis in the early 80s. And as soon as the nodes in the early 80s moved into Taurus and Scorpio, they then discovered what the virus was and how it was transmitted. So even though there was still a lot of fear around how, around getting it, of course, but then it was a lot of the fear was taken out because they discovered how it was transmitted, what the virus actually was. So we are likely to see then by the end of September onwards, with this particular coronavirus, some insight. Another example I could use is that the last time that I think was the last time. Yeah, it was the Human Genome Project was completed. Yeah, so that was the last time. And of course, that's all about mapping the genome, right? The human genome. And so this is likely that we're going to see some sort of insights into not just the virus, but in terms of how our body works in antibodies and all of that. Because Taurus and Scorpio is very much about, finding that balance right again between, removing the fears, going there, discovering, researching. That's all about Scorpio. And then increasing our stability, which is Taurus. And we can only increase our stability if we can go into the darkness, if we can go into and investigate something, how something is operating that is creating a problem. That's Scorpio. We can only do it if we go there. And by going there, we can then increase our sense of well-being and stability and safety in Taurus. So this is a big theme that's going to shift now at the end of September, and at least take away some of the fear that's been around with the virus and the god and goddess of death being particularly activated. So just to finish, I'm going to just briefly maybe take questions, and if anyone has any questions, you can start typing them into the chat box if you prefer, or after I finish this recording, you might want to ask me by unmuting yourself or putting your hand up if you can figure out where the hand button is. I'll just finish with this kind of overall view of, where are we going with all of this, I guess. So, of course, we've had the Saturn-Pluto conjunction last year and this year, and this is what's led to this in many ways. This is probably one of the more challenging ones. But by mid-decade, we have the Saturn-Neptune. And then by the end of the decade into the next decade, we have Saturn-Uranus. And so these are all, of course, the outer planets, and we can have a better view of the kind of long-term picture when we look at the outer planets. So this Saturn-Pluto, of course, brings this sort of end times feel and literally endings. It's going to mean there's an ending of the way things are, and we have to change and move on. And the Neptune creates this sense of things dissolving in some way, and sort of this ideal approach or a need for a more idealized way moving forward. And so that will, by mid decade, become the theme of, dissolving boundaries again. Because one of the things that Saturn-Pluto does is that even though boundaries are dissolved, what ends up happening is that we put them and enforce them even more. Because, if we feel threatened, for example, if a company feels like it's going under, it's going to try even more harder to stay afloat. If something's threatened, if a country's threatened, it builds its borders even more. So this is another side of this, is that even though this feels like end times, we struggle with that, of course, and when things have to change, we struggle and we try and keep it afloat even more, so like the economy or whatever it might be. But Neptune Saturn is a very different feel by the middle of the decade, and so it'll feel like, things are sort of like melting away in a way. And so the divisions we put up now can actually be dissolved more, and sort of a more unified, I would say, field come in by the middle of the decade, and new things to come about, new kind of ways of doing things that we can't really see now because we're so in the thick of this sort of dissolution and the need to kind of hold on, But by the end of the decade into the next decade, we have Uranus come in with Saturn, and that sparks something completely new, some new ideas, some new ways of doing things that we just cannot see right now, because right now is the dissolution phase. And so we need to go through through a dissolution phase first before we have this idealized view of what we could happen in the future by mid-decade, and then literally start something new by the next decade. So that's sort of the more bigger picture worldview of what's happening with these long-term transits. I hope you've enjoyed that. I'm just going to let you know a little bit about, if you have any questions, remember to type it in or raise your hand and I will unmute you and you can ask the question. But just to finish off this recording, I'm just going to mention that you can become a patron of what I do on my website, timelineastrology.com, or you go to patreon.com/timelineastrology. And there I basically write daily posts for patrons, as well as monthly forecasts and horoscopes. So you can have a look at that if you'd like to follow me in my work. And I obviously talk a lot about all of these transits in more detail. And I do, daily and monthly forecasts. So have a look and thank you for joining me. I'm going to stop recording and I'm going to take questions.